Okay, so in this video we're going to take a detailed look at diffuse, specular and shadow passes. You'll notice I've got a completely blank scene file, and I have set up our frame range to go from frame 1 through to frames 650 so that we have the entire length of our animation in play. So I'm going to switch over to the composite view, and I'm going to switch over to our compositing networks context and create a new image network, which I'm going to rename to Shot 2, as over the next series of videos we're going to start out by compositing together Shot 2, and in this video where we're dealing with diffuse, specular and shadows, we're going to use passes from Shot 2 to demonstrate that. So I'm going to jump inside, and the first thing I need to do is bring in a few passes. We're going to bring in the diffuse and specular pass for our main spotlights, and we're going to bring in the shadow pass for our main spotlights, and they're going to be for our character, the diffuse and specular passes. So let's bring in a file cop and browse to our projects folder. I'm going to grab our character, and I'm going to grab our character main spots diffuse and accept. And we do need to change the playback range. I'm going to set that to 219 to 300, which was the frames for our second shot. So there we've got our diffuse pass for our character for Shot 2. I'm going to push the backtick to bring up the image browser. Is going to allow us to bring in file cops with images. And I'm going to grab our character underscore main spots underscore specular $f and bring in our specular pass as well. So now we can see our specular pass. I'm going to push backtick once more, jump up and grab the shadows for our main spots and bring those in. And we can see that the shadows are in the alpha channel. So there we have the shadows for our main spotlights. So let's begin by talking about compositing together diffuse and specular. And in the quick demonstration video we used a screen cop to composite together diffuse and specular, but I mentioned there are actually multiple ways of going together, basically compositing together these two passes. When talking about a lighting model, diffuse and specular passes are simply added together. We take our diffuse component, we take our specular component, and we add them. And what would that look like as an equation? Well, let's jump over to the whiteboard. I'm going to bring up a new layer, and let's write this down as an equation. So let's create a new layer. And we can simply think of it as being our final color equal to the color from image 1 plus the color from image 2. But this poses a problem. What if we were to have pure white in image 1? So we'd have a value of 1, 1, 1. And what if we were to have pure white in image 2? We'd have a value of 1, 1, 1. So what would our final color be equal to? It would be equal to 1, 1, 1 plus 1, 1, 1. So we'd add our reds together, we'd add our greens together, we'd add our blues together. The final result would be a color value of 2, 2, 2. So we've gone above a color value of 1. We've gone to super white values. And that's going to be a result if you just simply use an add. So we could use an add cop to composite these together. And let's jump into Houdini and show the add cop. So we do have the add cop. It takes in two inputs, and it will simply add the color in input 1 and every single pixel to the corresponding pixel color in input 2. But we have an alternative approach, and that's using the screen. And we saw the screen when we were dealing with the quick introduction to compositing. The screen uses a slightly different formula for combining our color 1 and our color 2. The screen sets the final color equal to color 1 plus color 2, so far we're the same, but then we subtract color 1 times color 2, and this prevents us from getting values above 1. So let's take a look at how that works. Let's say we had this example again where we've got a value of white in both color channels. We'd have a value of 1, 1, 1 plus 1, 1, 1, and subtract from that 1, 1, 1 times 1, 1, 1. So we can see that 1, 1, 1 plus 1, 1, 1, that came out as 2, 2, 2. So we're going to have 2, 2, 2. And over here, 1 times 1 is going to come out as 1. So we're going to have minus 1, 1, 1. So if we take 2 and minus 1, we're going to be left with a result of 1. So you can see by using this slightly modified equation where we not only add together the two colours, we also then multiply the two colours together and subtract them from that added result. That's going to prevent us from getting values greater than white. So that's why my personal preference is to use a screen over an add, because it gives slightly nicer results, I feel, when compositing together diffuse and specular passes. Both screen and add are valid approaches to compositing diffuse and specular, and different artists choose to use different methods. So I do highly recommend going away and playing with both the add and the screen comp and seeing which method you prefer. Throughout the rest of these videos, I'm going to be using the screen because that is the method that I prefer to use. So now that we've taken a look at the screen equation, let's jump over back to Houdini and delete out our add and create a screen comp. So the screen comp has two inputs, one for our color 1 and one for our color 2. So we can feed in our diffuse for our main spots and our specular. And what that's going to do is going to go through for each pixel, and it's going to say what is the color value of the pixel in image 1, and add that to the color value of the pixel in image 2, and then subtract those two values added together. So it will apply this C equals C1 plus C2 minus C1 times C2 equation for every single pixel in the image, and the result will be that our diffuse pass and our specular pass have been combined using that equation, such that we can see, you can just make out the specular highlights being combined along with our diffuse. Now we have the ability to go in and change the weighting on these images, effectively fading the image to black before screening it. Our foreground is going to be our diffuse pass, since this is the foreground input. Our background is the specular pass. So if we were to change the foreground weight and decrease that, we're effectively taking our diffuse pass and making it go closer and closer to black before screening it in with our specular. So we can even decrease that all the way down and just be left with our specular pass. Or we can bring down our specular pass closer and closer to black before combining it with the diffuse pass. So we have complete control over the weighting between the two passes when we're combining them together with the screen. So the screen is going to be used whenever we're combining diffuse and specular together. And now we can go ahead and combine our shadows with the diffuse and specular passes. The problem being, the shadows in this case are most apparent on our floor. And we're currently looking at our character. So I'm going to go ahead and switch out the diffuse and specular passes for our character with the diffuse and specular passes for our set, again for our main spotlights. So I'm going to come over to our character main spots diffuse. I'm going to jump up a level, grab our set, and grab our set's main spot diffuse. That's kind of funny with the character's specular highlights there. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab our character's specular, jump up, and grab our set's main spots specular. So now we're dealing with having screened together the specular and diffuse for our set. Now the specular for our set is almost non-existent, so we're not really going to see a specular highlight, and that's just due to the camera angle we had. And again, as mentioned in the previous video, we are still going to keep compositing together passes, even though it appears there may be nothing in the pass, just in case we have a different camera angle where those passes do have something in the pass. And since we're going to be reusing these assets to composite for multiple shots, we want to make sure that we have all of our passes being taken into account, even if in a specific situation they are redundant. So now that we've got these screened together, how do we go about affecting this pass with our shadows? Well, our shadow pass is completely black in the color channel. All of the pixels in our color have a value of 0, 0, 0. But in the alpha channel, we have information describing where our shadows are. We have a value of 1 where we want shadows, fading off to a value of 0 when we don't want shadows. So how can we use this information? Well, we can think of it as being the alpha channel describing where we want to layer black over our other image, or in other words, where do we want to darken our image, and by darkening our image we're giving the idea of shadows. So we can think of taking our alpha channel, and wherever it's white we're going to paint black over our image. Why black? Because we have black in our color channel. So we're going to paint black over our image, effectively darkening the image, so effectively painting shadows into the image. If we have slightly less intense shadows, they're going to have a grey value. And if we have no shadows, we're going to have black in the alpha, so we won't paint any of our color over the image. Well, how we go about doing this painting of the color of the black color over our image? We can use the composite comp. So composite comp, And again, as briefly mentioned in the previous video, this works like the composite VOP we saw in TD Volume 1. We have a foreground input and we have a background input, and we can go ahead and say that we want to layer our shadows over our set. So we have our shadows being layered in our foreground, our set being the background, and the composite cop's going to layer the foreground over the background using the alpha information in the foreground. So when we bring up our visibility, we can see that we have the alpha information in our foreground, which is our shadows, layering black over our set. So as we start scrubbing, we can see the shadows being layered over our set. Now there is something I do want to draw your attention to back up on the screen, and that's something that we're going to have to take into account whenever we're combining various layers together, and that's our alpha channel. Because on the screen, when we combine, we've not just actually been combining color, we've also been combining alpha. It's going to be fairly hard to see, but we can bring our visibility up, switch over to alpha, and hunt down the edge of our stage. And we can see that we've got the alpha channel for our set, and that's the same in both our diffuse and our specular passes. But since we're combining both color and alpha, when we come down to our screen, pay very close attention to these two lines of pixels. Our alpha channel has been affected because we've taken the alpha from this image, and screened them together. Now, just doing one screen, that's not too noticeable in the final result, but we're going to be screening together and adding together multiple different lighting passes, and over that sequence of steps, this alpha edge of the alpha is going to get sharper and sharper and sharper, to the point when we come to layer things like our character over the set, we're going to have a very noticeable edge. So what we need to do, whenever we're using screens or ads, I'm going to come over to the mask tab and make sure our plane scope is set to not add the alpha. You see, when we are including alpha in our effect, we're adding screening the alpha. When we uncheck alpha, we're going back to having the exact same alpha as our original passes. So I did just want to point that out as a final thing in this video before we go ahead and wrap this up by creating an asset out of these guys, because this is going to be important, and it might not be obvious at first why we're doing that, but you want to make sure that our alpha channel is the exact same alpha channel that we were getting with any one pass. We don't want to be affecting our alpha channels by the combinations of the lighting. So now we've seen we can combine our diffuse, we can combine our specular by using a screen, and once we have that, we can go ahead and combine our shadows over the top. We have a fairly large number of lights that would have diffuse, specular, and shadows. We've got our main spotlights on everybody, and we've also got our secondary spotlights on pretty much everybody. So why not make an asset out of these guys that we can reuse time and time again? So I'm going to select all of these nodes, I'm going to push Shift-C to collapse them down into a subnetwork, and I'm going to rename this subnetwork to something like diffuse, specular, and shadow. And it's worth noting, when we jump inside the subnetwork, how do we choose which part of the subnetwork is going to be basically rendered out as the output? You can notice it's not where we have our visibility when we're in the subnetwork, because here we're only seeing the diffuse pass. When we're on the side, we're seeing the shadow pass and everything combined. It's where we have the render flag checked, and right now we've got the render flag checked on main spots. We want to make sure the render flag is checked on our composite. If we jump back up, we're now seeing the output of our subnet, reflecting what we've truly wanted to be the output of our subnet. So we can right click on this subnet and we can create a digital asset from this subnet, much like a subnet over in the SOPs context or in the VOPs context. And I'm going to create a series of compositing assets. So let's give this a name of diffuse, so diff spec, that's just an S, spec, shadow with the label diffuse, specular, and shadow, and I'm going to save this into a custom OTL where I'm going to put all of my compositing assets. So let's bring up our OTLs and find our OTLs folder, and I'm going to create a compositing.otl. So if we accept this, and I do only want to install this to the current HIP file, so it's going to bring up the type properties, and I'm going to shrink this down. And on the parameters tab, I'm going to create 3 file parameters by promoting up the file parameters from nodes. Which parameters am I talking about? I'm talking about where we specified our diffuse sequence, our specular sequence, and our shadow sequence. I'm then going to promote up our foreground and background weight from our screen, which is going to give us direct control over our diffuse intensity and our specular intensity. And then I'm going to come down and bring in the foreground weight on our composite, which is going to give us control over our shadows. If we accept this and take a look and bring down our foreground weight, the foreground weight fades off our shadows, so we also have control over shadow intensity. So let's bring up the type properties for our assets. I'm going to right click, come down to type properties, jump back down inside, and let's start out by promoting up our diffuse file path. Now before I do that, I want to make sure that I uncheck prefix, link name, and label. I'm going to right click and export that parameter to this type properties, giving it a file name of diffuse file, and the label for this parameter I'll give as diffuse sequence, so that if we apply that and jump up, we can see we've got diffuse sequence where we now specify our diffuse. I'm going to do the same for our specular, so I'm going to right click, export parameter to type properties. Let's rename our parameter name to specular file with a label of specular sequence. And let's go ahead and grab our shadow file, right click and export parameter to type properties. I'll give this a parameter name of shadow file and a label of shadow sequence, and apply that. Now in between our files and our controls for the files, I'm going to go ahead and create a separator to keep things nice and organized. And then I'm going to go ahead and promote up those weight values. So on the screen we have our foreground weight, which is affecting the weighting of our diffuse. So I'm going to right click and export parameter to type properties. I'm going to rename this to diffuse intense for intensity and give it a label of diffuse intensity. And I'm going to right click and export our background weight. So export parameter type properties, and this will be our specular intensity. So specular intensity. And then finally I'm going to come down to our composite and export our foreground weight, and that will become our shadow intensity. So shad intensity. So if we accept this and then jump up to asset level, we now have control over setting our diffuse, specular and shadow sequences. And then we can say, okay, I want my diffuse intensity to be brighter or darker. We'd have control over the specular intensity and also our shadow intensity. So with that, we've created an asset that's going to be very useful in creating some of our various object assets, because this is a fundamental building block for a number of our lights. So with that, we've taken a look at compositing together diffuse, specular and shadow, and in the next video we're going to go ahead and start compositing together the set by reusing this asset. So thanks a lot.